The idea here is that really unacceptable consequences have to be avoided. And it seems to me that there are three ways to avoid unacceptable consequences. One is to reconsider your answer to question number one and ask, is the Constitution really just the text? Maybe some fundamental features of the American political and legal system can't be explained by the Constitution, but nevertheless meet any reasonable jurisprudential test of what the law really is. As I say, I think that is Fallinism. I believe it to be Straussianism. It is, in a particular sense. It is debatable, but it is an entirely coherent position, and it is one for which there is substantial evidence. So that's one answer. Change your answer to question number one. Another response to possible unacceptable consequences is to change the text that is producing them. Mike Rappaport talked about this a little bit. That's my preferred solution. I think the tool of constitutional amendment should be used a lot more often. I also think that if it became likely that anyone authoritative was going to do something really disastrous in the name of originalism or any other constitutional principle, there would be constitutional amendments that would prevent it or undo it, and that would be a very good thing. That having an authoritative textual formulation of what the Constitution has decided, what the country has decided on these basic questions like Social Security, like having an independent central bank, would be a real step forward and would be worth substantial disruption. Having said that, I should point out to conservatives in particular, what I just said means that originalism and any other program of constitutional interpretation is not a program of radical change, because by and large, the American people don't want radical change. And if it looked like originalism were going to produce it, they wouldn't stand for it. They would change the text. So don't think that this is a means to fundamentally change what the country is doing. But the Article 5 process is. The other possibility is to change the answer to question 2. Rather than changing the answer to question 1, rather than changing the text, is to come up with some other characterization of the ultimate object of inquiry. And one way to do that, and I think the more principled way, but I'm about to say it's impossible, is to go through all the possible answers to question number 2. What might be the object of inquiry? And for each one of them, play out the next 30, 40, 50 years of American history on every important question that comes up under the Constitution. Decide what the consequences are, add up the consequences, and say which one comes out best. That's not possible. Consider simply the question, what if Brown against the Board had been decided differently, and the Supreme Court had said it's okay to have separate, as long as it's equal? What would have happened? How many courts would have followed the Delaware Chancery Court in one of the Brown cases and said, okay, even if the principle is separate but equal, as a matter of fact, the only way to achieve equality is to have integration? How many states would have said, okay, we're going to have real equality. We are genuinely going to equalize the resources available to black and white children. After a few years, what would Congress have done with its spending powers to encourage integration or the improvement of black education? And 20 or 30 years later, how would that look from the standpoint of consequences? Or, if the Supreme Court hadn't adopted intermediate scrutiny in the 1970s with respect to sex discrimination, would the Equal Rights Amendment have been adopted? Would something else have happened? And what would be the consequences of that? And answer those questions for 30, 40, 50 possibilities that come up under the Constitution. No one can do that with any confidence. No one can rerun American history, or in these cases actually run it in advance, figure out what's going to happen. That is just too difficult. The only thing we really know about the future is, as Bill James, the great baseball theorist, said, it will resemble the past more than it resembles our attempts to predict it. So that way of replacing alpha is sort of chasing omega. And by omega here I mean the first transfinite cardinal, the number that comes after all the other counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, and you go on and on and on and on and on, and when you're done with all of those, you get to omega. But you never get to omega because it's an infinite distance away. That's not possible. The other way of changing the answer to question 2 is to have what I'd call alpha prime. Alpha prime is just alpha, except if something really bad is going to happen, don't let it happen. That's alpha prime. And the problem with alpha prime and this is implicit in what I said about the way people go about answering question number 2, is that no one really thinks that's a plausible answer to questions about meaning. Does anybody really think that the meaning of any public pronouncement can be determined by having the presumption that it can't mean something really bad? How would the people who thought, like U.S. Grant, that a war of aggression against Mexico was a grave act of injustice, to which Grant, as he said later, was bitterly opposed at the time, would they say that therefore the declaration of war on Mexico doesn't mean war on Mexico is declared? No, they wouldn't, because alpha prime isn't a plausible answer to a question about the meaning of a text. It's a form of gobbledygook. And the last and most important thing I want to say is that rejecting alpha prime and its relatives as answers to question number 2 is by way of directing us, is important insofar as it directs us elsewhere. Perhaps the most important place it directs us to is back to question number 1. It also can direct us to questions number 3 and 4, as we've seen at this symposium. But back to question number 1. Is the Constitution really the supreme law? And if it is, and is to be interpreted in this fashion, is it legitimate? Those are extremely important questions, and they need to be debated as such. What the country doesn't need is weasel words and attempts to avoid those really hard questions by saying plausible sounding and isn't it great at a Senate confirmation hearing kind of things about question number 2. Those are, as I say, gobbledygook. And one of the things I think that poor Richard taught us is you have to think harder than that. Thanks.
Thank you, John. I always thought the owl of Minerva flew at twilight, so I'm glad to hear that omen's been put off for a few hours.
I'm never up by twilight.
I think the owl of Minerva flies at dusk.
Dusk. Synonym for twilight.
There you go.